September 1944, Eastern France. The German army was on its heels, desperately trying to slow the American advance. The Wehrmacht High Command had just received news that would change everything. A new fleet of fresh Panther tanks, the most feared medium tank in Europe, had arrived at the front. Hitler's generals were confident. They had 113 brand-new Panther tanks, manned by crews fresh from Germany. They had firepower, they had armor, they had everything the Allies feared. But on one September morning, as thick fog rolled across the French countryside near a small town called Arracourt, something went catastrophically wrong. What happened over the next 6 days would shatter the myth of German panzer superiority and prove that no tank, no matter how invincible it seemed, could overcome the fog of war. This is a story about armor, tactics, and what happens when a giant can't see. By the summer of 1944, Germany was in crisis. The Allies had landed in Normandy on June 6th. The Soviet Union was pushing from the east. The Wehrmacht was being crushed from both sides. But there was one weapon that Germany believed could turn the tide: the Panther tank. The Panther was the most advanced medium tank in the world. It had thick, sloped armor that could deflect almost anything the Americans threw at it. It carried a long 75mm gun that could destroy an American Sherman from over a mile away. The Sherman, by comparison, needed to be much closer to even have a chance.
German generals looked at this tank and saw invincibility. Hitler himself believed that flooding the front with Panthers would stop the American advance cold. So, in September 1944, the Wehrmacht scraped together every Panther they could field. Whole new regiments were formed. Fresh crews, barely trained, were given crash courses in tank warfare and told, "Hold the line." The 111th Panzer Brigade and the 11th Panzer Division were assigned to block American forces advancing toward Arracourt, a small town in eastern France near the Moselle River. The Germans had a plan: use their superior firepower to destroy the American armor in open field engagements. If they could stop the Americans here, they could stabilize the line. Panthers versus Shermans. German engineering versus American industrial might. The Germans were confident they knew how this battle would end. They were wrong. On the American side, Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division was commanded by Colonel Bruce C. Clark. He was no rookie. He had fought across North Africa and through Sicily. He knew German tactics. He knew how Panthers operated. And he had something the Germans didn't have: information. Clark knew Panthers were coming. His reconnaissance units had reported new German armor movements. He knew he couldn't win in a head-to-head fight with fresh Panther crews in open terrain. Shermans couldn't match Panthers in firepower or frontal armor. So Clark made a decision that would prove to be genius. He would defend in depth. His forces wouldn't be concentrated in one defensive line. Instead, they would be spread out, using the terrain. They would let the Germans attack. They would let the Germans come to them. And most importantly, he would use something the Germans couldn't control: the weather.
September 18th, 1944. Dawn broke over the Arracourt salient, cold and wet. A dense morning fog rolled across the landscape, covering everything in a grey blanket. For the American forces, this fog was a gift. Their defensive positions were already established. Their crews knew the terrain. They could fight in the darkness and mist. For the Germans, this fog was a catastrophe. It negated their single greatest advantage: the superior range and accuracy of the Panther's 75mm gun. The Panther was designed for open-field warfare. It was designed to use its powerful gun to destroy enemy tanks from long range, where American Shermans couldn't reach it. The Panther's gunners were trained to aim for distant targets across open countryside. But fog changes everything. When visibility drops to just 100 to 200 yards, that 1,000-yard advantage means nothing. More importantly, the German crews arriving at Arracourt had a fatal weakness. They were green, fresh from training. Many were barely old enough to shave. Some German officers would later admit their crews had only 2 weeks of training before being thrown into combat. They didn't know how to navigate terrain they couldn't see. They didn't know how to react when visibility vanished. They didn't know how to fight a close-in tank battle. Average experience, 2 weeks training. Many couldn't read maps, unfamiliar with French terrain, no veteran leadership. And there was another problem. The German formations arriving at Arracourt had almost no reconnaissance units. They couldn't scout ahead. They couldn't feel out American positions. They had to advance blindly, hoping to stumble into American tanks and destroy them from range. It was a formula for disaster.
The first German attack came at 8 a.m. on September 18th. Panther tanks started moving toward the American positions, their commanders peering through the fog, trying to spot enemies they couldn't see. Company-sized elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade probed forward, about 15 to 20 tanks moving cautiously through the mist. What they didn't know was that American forces were watching them. Even in the fog, even at short range, the Americans could see the massive shapes of the Panthers approaching. But the Americans didn't panic. They held their fire. The Panthers came closer, closer, 70 yards, 60 yards, 50 yards. This is where the Panther's thick frontal armor became less important. At close range, even a Sherman's gun could penetrate Panther side armor, and the Sherman's turret rotated faster. In a close-in brawl, speed could defeat armor. At close range, speed matters more than firepower. And then it started. American tank guns thundered out of the fog. The explosions were deafening. Panthers that thought they were going to destroy isolated American tanks suddenly found themselves under fire, their superior range meaningless. The fog worked against the Panthers in every way. They couldn't see incoming fire until it was too late. They couldn't coordinate with other tanks because radio communications were degraded by the mist. They couldn't retreat into open ground to use their long-range guns. They were fighting in conditions that negated their entire advantage. In the first day of fighting, the Americans killed or crippled 11 German Panther tanks. 11 fresh Panthers with armor and firepower the Americans could barely touch in a fair fight. But there was nothing fair about this fight.
Colonel Clark knew what he was doing. He had spread his forces thin intentionally. When the Germans attacked one American position, other American units would flank them. When a Panther tried to use its superior firepower, it found itself surrounded. The Germans learned a brutal lesson over the next 6 days. Numerical and technical superiority means nothing if you can't see. September 19th, the German High Command was confused. They had sent in Panthers with the expectation of crushing the Americans in open field combat. Instead, they were losing tanks at an alarming rate. So they sent in more Panthers. The 111th Panzer Brigade attacked again, and again the fog covered the battlefield. Again and again the same story repeated. German tanks advancing through fog, unable to see American positions. American forces, knowing the terrain, striking from concealment. Flanking maneuvers, point-blank firefights where speed and coordination mattered more than armor thickness. But the story of Arracourt isn't really about tank-on-tank battles. It's about something deeper. The Americans weren't just using tanks. They were using combined arms, artillery, tank destroyers, infantry. While German Panthers were trying to fight tank duels, they were being pounded by American artillery from positions they couldn't see. A German Panther commander would see a distant American tank through the fog, try to line up a shot, and suddenly his tank would be hit by a shell from artillery positioned miles away. He'd never even see the threat. The Panther was designed to be an anti-tank weapon, but at Arracourt it became a victim of American combined arms tactics.
After the battle, German commanders filed report after report trying to explain why they'd lost so many Panthers. One report reads, "The fog that had allowed German forces tactical surprise in protection from US air attack also negated the superior range of their tank guns." It's a sentence that captures the entire battle. The very thing that helped the Germans, the fog, ended up destroying them, because they couldn't adapt to close-in fighting. Their crews weren't trained for it. Their tactics assumed open-field engagement. By September 23rd, the Germans had lost so many tanks they had to break off the attack. The 111th and 11th Panzer units were pulled back, too weakened to continue, and the myth of Panther invincibility was dead. The Battle of Arracourt is one of the least-known engagements of World War II, but it mattered more than most people realize. Before Arracourt, American tankers were terrified of Panthers. Every report from the front said the same thing. Panther tanks are unstoppable. Shermans are outgunned. Americans are dying because our tanks can't compete. But Arracourt proved something different. It proved that tactics, terrain, and training could overcome technical superiority. It proved that a Panther wasn't invincible. It proved that American commanders who understood combined arms warfare could use their strengths to negate German armor advantages. After Arracourt, American tankers fought differently. They stopped thinking of Panthers as invincible killers. They started thinking of them as targets to be trapped, flanked, and destroyed using superior tactics. The American army learned that you don't beat a superior tank by fighting it on its own terms. You beat it by changing the rules, by using terrain, by using numbers, by using artillery and air power, and infantry working together.
This lesson rippled through the entire American army. Combined arms became the doctrine. Panthers were no longer feared. They were expected losses in the face of superior American tactics. For the Germans, Arracourt was a wake-up call they couldn't ignore. They had gambled that new tanks would turn the tide. The gamble failed. The 111th Panzer Brigade was so badly damaged at Arracourt that it had to be reconstituted. The 11th Panzer Division limped away, missing 40-plus tanks. And the Germans had learned the same lesson the Americans had. You can build the best tank in the world, but if your crews don't know how to use it and your tactics don't account for the reality of the battlefield, none of it matters. The Panther would go on to fight for the rest of the war. It would have individual successes. Individual crews would rack up kill counts. But the aura of invincibility was gone. The myth had died in the fog near Arracourt. Today, Arracourt is a small town like any other in eastern France. There are shops and cafes and people going about their daily lives. Almost nobody remembers that one of the most important tank battles of World War II happened here. There are monuments to the fallen. There are plaques marking where tanks were destroyed, but most visitors drive past without even knowing what happened. Colonel Bruce C. Clark didn't become as famous as Patton or Montgomery. He didn't write memoirs that became bestsellers. But his tactical genius at Arracourt saved hundreds of American lives and proved that courage and intelligence could beat raw German firepower.
The Sherman tankers who fought at Arracourt didn't get medals for it. History books don't remember their names, but they proved something that would echo through military history, that you don't need the biggest gun or the thickest armor to win. You need intelligence, adaptability, and the willingness to fight on your own terms. One American tanker was interviewed after the war and asked about fighting Panthers. His response was simple: a Panther is just a target if you know how to approach it. That's what Arracourt taught the American army, and that knowledge changed the course of the war. After Arracourt, the American advance accelerated. The Germans couldn't stop them with Panther tanks. They couldn't stop them with superior armor. They could only slow them down. By the time the war ended in May 1945, American forces had crushed the German Wehrmacht and reached the Rhine. The Panther had lost its mystique. It was just another tank to be destroyed. The Battle of Arracourt should be remembered for what it really was: a masterclass in tactical adaptation, a fog-shrouded David versus Goliath match where intelligence beat raw power. The Germans came with Panther tanks, believing firepower would decide the battle. The Americans came with something more dangerous: a commander who understood terrain, weather, and combined arms.
Colonel Clark didn't have the newest tanks, he didn't have the most impressive firepower, but he had something the German commanders lacked: flexibility. He adapted to the fog instead of fighting against it. He used terrain to his advantage. He coordinated artillery, infantry, and tank movements into a unified attack instead of isolated tank duels. The Panther wasn't beaten because American Shermans were superior. They weren't. The Panther was beaten because German doctrine assumed open-field warfare, and German crews weren't trained to handle close-in combat in foggy terrain. It's a lesson that extends far beyond World War II. Superior equipment doesn't win wars. Superior tactics do. Bigger guns don't win battles. Better planning does. More impressive armor doesn't stop determined enemies. Understanding how to use what you have does. The myth of the invincible tank died in the fog near Arracourt, France, in September 1944, and the American army learned a lesson that would shape military doctrine for the next 50 years.